They called me a remnant when the golden child was born. Once that happened, my parents sent me off to boarding school, and after leaving, I couldn't bring myself to face them again. My mother was enraged. I had grown up surrounded by abundance, but I never felt like I truly fit into that world. My parents, Christopher and Caroline Hastings, embodied wealth and high society in San Francisco. They lived in a vast estate on a hill overlooking the bay, a place straight out of a magazine. It had white pillars, perfectly trimmed lawns, marble floors, and glittering chandeliers. Every room served a purpose, though no one actually used them. Yet, for all its grandeur, that mansion was nothing more than an empty shell. My parents didn't want a son. I wasn't just an unplanned addition to their lives. They outright resented me. They had envisioned a flawless life with 2 daughters, and my arrival shattered that dream. From the moment I was born, their disappointment was palpable. They couldn't even look at me without it clouding their expressions. Perhaps I wasn't what they had imagined. Or maybe they simply weren't capable of loving me. Either way, I was nothing more than a burden, a constant reminder of something that hadn't gone as planned. I'll never forget overhearing them argue when I was about 5. They were in their bedroom, using hushed, angry tones they assumed I couldn't hear. My father was trying to reassure my mother, telling her it wasn't her fault and that these things just happened. But she was inconsolable, screaming about how she'd always wanted daughters and how this wasn't supposed to be their reality. They weren't supposed to be the kind of couple with an unwanted son. After I was born, they visited every major fertility clinic in the country. Johns Hopkins, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, you name it, they went there. Even though they were young and healthy, they kept searching for answers, desperate to understand why they couldn't have the perfect family they had envisioned. They even traveled overseas, flying to elite clinics in London and Switzerland for treatments. My mother came home with bags of vitamins and hormone injections, swearing that this time things would work out. But nothing ever did. Then, when I was 6, they returned from a consultation in New York, and for the first time, my mother looked radiant. She was glowing in a way I couldn't remember seeing before. She was pregnant. At last, their dream of 2 perfect daughters was back on track. For the first time, my mom didn't look at me with that cold, distant expression. In her eyes, I no longer existed. Her entire world now revolved around the baby girl she was carrying. The pregnancy was treated with reverence. My mom quit her job, hired nutritionists, personal trainers, a doula, and, of course, the best doctors money could buy. When my sister Isabella was born, everything stopped. She was their golden child from her very first breath. I still vividly remember the day they brought her home. My mom cradled her like she was the most precious thing in the world, her face glowing with pride. Naturally, they named her after a queen. It was the kind of thing they would do. The contrast in how they treated her, compared to me, was impossible to ignore. While I was tolerated, Isabella was adored. Every milestone she reached was an occasion for celebration. When she smiled, they called it a sign of her brilliance. I had never seen them so joyful, and it was all because of her. Not long after Isabella came home, my parents sent me away to a private boarding school in Vermont called Northwood Academy. I didn't want to leave San Francisco, but they made it seem like a wonderful opportunity. The truth was, they couldn't wait to get rid of me. With Isabella in their lives, I was no longer needed to disrupt their picture-perfect family image. I was packed up like unwanted baggage and shipped off to a school filled with strangers. Northwood wasn't just a school, it was a fortress for the privileged. It had pristine grounds, manicured gardens, sprawling libraries, and more amenities than any child could dream of. But none of that mattered. From the very first day, I knew I didn't belong there. My classmates didn't care that I came from a wealthy family. They quickly figured out that I was the throwaway kid, the one whose family didn't even pretend to love him. In a place like that, kids knew exactly how to exploit weaknesses. They gave me cruel nicknames: reject, mistake, leftover. Those were the words they hurled at me in the hallways or during meals. I'd be sitting in the dining hall and someone would sneer, "Look, it's the kid his parents didn't want." I'd laugh it off, but their words cut deep. They knew I wasn't like them. They had families who visited and cared about them. No one ever came for me. As the years went by, my parents grew more distant. They visited maybe once a year, and even then, it felt more like a chore than anything else. Their visits were brief and formal. They'd ask about my grades, scold me about my behavior, and then leave as quickly as they had come. My mother would go on and on about Isabella, how she was excelling in ballet and working with private tutors to become the best at everything. It was clear that every penny spent on me was, in their eyes, a waste. I wasn't worth their time or attention. David worked at a factory that made automotive parts, managing a team that built engines. His life was simple, but he seemed genuinely happy. When I visited him, I envied his contentment. He didn't carry the weight of impossible expectations or try to live up to a perfect standard. He was satisfied with his small apartment and his close-knit group of friends. In some ways, I think he saw a part of himself in me, the one who didn't quite fit into the family's mold. He would tell me stories about growing up, about how he always felt overshadowed by my dad's success, and how he was expected to achieve more but never quite measured up. I understood that feeling far too well. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had learned how to numb myself to the pain, isolation, and rejection. It all became background noise. I had realized I was never going to be anyone's priority, so I stopped trying. I turned my focus to school, not because I cared about it, but because it was the only thing I had left. I wasn't popular or athletic. I was just there, moving through each day, waiting for it to end. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, the sense of being unwanted never completely went away. Even when I was surrounded by others, I felt completely alone. My parents had their perfect daughter, and I was just a constant reminder of a mistake they wished they could forget. I drifted through the years, caught between two worlds, the world of privilege and the world of loneliness. I had everything money could buy, but it didn't matter when the people who were supposed to love me couldn't even stand to look at me. That's how I survived, not by living, but by enduring. By the time I graduated from Northwood Academy, I was done with my parents. They may have financed everything from my education to my living expenses, but emotionally, they had abandoned me a long time ago. All they ever gave me was financial support, and that was enough for me now. I didn't need their approval or love anymore. I just needed their money, and I was determined to use it to get as far away from them as possible. After graduation, I decided to study abroad. It wasn't just about escaping my family in San Francisco. I wanted to be somewhere new, a place where I could start over. I didn't want to carry the label of being the unwanted son or relive the memories of being treated like a mistake. I applied to several prestigious universities and eventually got into the London School of Economics. LSE was elite, respected, and far enough from home that I wouldn't have to see my parents or my sister Isabella except during the rare family gatherings I couldn't find an excuse to avoid. My parents didn't argue with my decision. In fact, I think they were relieved. My father wired me a large amount of money for tuition, housing, and other expenses, and I suspect he was secretly pleased I chose London. The distance allowed them to keep up the appearance of a caring family without actually having to deal with me in person. LSE turned out to be everything I had hoped for. The city, the people, the atmosphere. It all felt like the perfect environment for me to reinvent myself. I majored in brokerage and finance, driven by the goal of building my own wealth and proving that I could succeed without relying on the Hastings name. I was tired of being seen as the unwanted son living off a trust fund. I wanted to create something of my own. But university came with its own challenges. From the moment I arrived, I could tell I didn't quite fit in with the old money crowd. The British elite had their own set of unspoken rules and hierarchies, and they were quick to remind outsiders like me that we didn't belong. My accent and background made me an easy target. Some of my classmates, many of whom were sons of aristocrats and generational wealth, would make sly remarks like, "Oh, look, the American. Is that how they do things in the colonies?" It wasn't the same kind of bullying I had faced in Vermont, but it was constant, subtle, and always intended to make me feel like an outsider. Still, I didn't let it bother me. Growing up as an outsider in my own family had prepared me for this. Dealing with a few entitled snobs wasn't anything new. What kept me going was the plan I had in my mind. Succeed, get rich, and leave everyone else behind. It wasn't all bad, though. I met others who, like me, were determined to carve out their own space in the world. One of those people was Tom, a guy from Toronto who was also studying brokerage and financial markets. We immediately hit it off. Like me, he wasn't part of the British elite, and we bonded over our shared experiences of feeling like outsiders. Tom was sharp, ambitious, and had a talent for spotting opportunities where others didn't. We both knew we didn't want to spend our lives working for someone else, so we started brainstorming ideas for our own brokerage firm. In our free time, we frequented exclusive clubs where the wealthy and powerful gathered. Places like the Civil Club and the Reform Club. These venues, steeped in tradition and old money, weren't for socializing, but for observing, learning, and making connections. We wanted to understand how the elite operated, how they managed their wealth, and how they built their empires. Getting into these places wasn't easy. You needed an invitation or someone to vouch for you. But Tom and I managed to network our way in, first as guests, and eventually as regulars. At these clubs, we met people who would later become our clients, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, and venture capitalists. We made a point of blending in, keeping a low profile, and focusing on learning the game so we could eventually play it better than anyone else. In my final year at LSE, something unexpected happened. I met a girl named Emily. She was also studying economics and shared the same drive and ambition that I had. Emily didn't come from a wealthy family. She was from a middle-class background in Manchester and deeply understood the importance of hard work. We connected almost instantly. For the first time in a long while, I felt like someone saw me for who I was, not as the unwanted son or the outsider, but simply as myself. Emma, Tom, and I spent our final year planning for the future. We were determined to open our own brokerage firm in New York, where the real money was. The three of us saved every penny from our internships, scraping together every bit we could. Between us, we managed to pull together $250,000. Not a massive amount in the grand scheme of things, but enough to get started. We named our firm Evergreen Capital. The name was simple and timeless, symbolizing growth and stability. We knew the competition in New York would be fierce, but we believed in our skills and our plan. Our goal was to target high-net-worth individuals and small institutions, offering personalized financial services that big banks couldn't match. Back in San Francisco, my parents remained as emotionally detached as ever. They had stopped even pretending to be interested in my life. The only times I heard from them were when they needed me to attend a family event or when Isabella wanted to flaunt her latest accomplishments. Isabella had been raised to look down on me, and she wholeheartedly embraced her role as the perfect daughter. She excelled in everything: ballet, piano, academic competitions, and my parents doted on her endlessly. She was their pride and joy, and she knew it. They had conditioned her to believe she was the family's shining star, while I was just a failed prototype. She made sure I was aware of it, too. The last time I saw her before moving to New York was at a charity gala my parents forced me to attend. Isabella was all charm, dazzling the crowd, while I stood on the sidelines, silently counting the minutes until I could leave. At one point, she approached me with that ever-present, perfect smile and said, "You know, they only invited you because they needed you for the family photo." That was the breaking point for me. I left the gala early, booked a flight to London that same night, and decided I wasn't going back. After graduation, Tom, Emily, and I relocated to New York and established Evergreen Capital in a modest midtown office. It wasn't anything grand, just a few desks and computers, but it was ours. We hit the ground running, leveraging every connection we had built over the years and drawing on everything we'd learned in those elite circles to secure our first clients. The market was highly competitive, but we were determined to carve out a space for ourselves. The first year was grueling. We worked long hours, often 7 days a week, hustling to grow our client base. We were competing against firms that had been in the business for decades, managing billions in assets. But we didn't let that intimidate us. Slowly but surely, we started gaining traction. We secured a few small institutional clients, including hedge funds, looking for a more personalized approach. Over time, our reputation began to build. It wasn't just the business that was flourishing. My relationship with Emily grew stronger as well. She wasn't just my partner in the firm, she became my partner in life. For the first time, I felt like I had a family of my own, one that I had chosen, one that truly cared about me. But despite all the success we were beginning to achieve, I could never completely escape the shadow of my family. My parents occasionally sent updates about Isabella's achievements, as if to remind me where I stood in the pecking order of their lives. They had moved on without me, but they wanted to ensure I knew I hadn't been entirely forgotten. It was their way of keeping me tethered to them, even though I no longer cared. Evergreen Capital was growing steadily. Our hard work was finally paying off, and our client list expanded with each passing quarter. The firm was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. We upgraded from our small midtown office to a sleek modern space with a stunning view of Manhattan. Sometimes it felt surreal to look around and realize we had built all of this from nothing, with no help from anyone but ourselves. Tom, Emily, and I had created something real, something that belonged to us, and I was proud of it. We started attracting bigger clients. Long-established, wealthy families, investment firms looking for fresh perspectives, and even a few celebrities who wanted to diversify their portfolios. We weren't the largest firm in New York, not by a long shot, but we had carved out a niche and made a name for ourselves. I finally felt like I was living a life completely separate from the one I had been stuck in for so long. My parents remained distant, occasionally sending obligatory updates about Isabella's endless successes. I had stopped caring. They were just lingering shadows from a past I had no interest in revisiting. My focus was on the future, on Evergreen Capital, my relationship with Emily, and the plans we had for the firm's expansion. But then everything began to unravel. It started with a phone call from my Uncle David. I hadn't spoken to David in a few weeks, which wasn't unusual. He was always busy and I was caught up with work. But when I answered the phone, something about his voice felt off. It sounded weaker than usual, like he was struggling just to get the words out. When I asked if he was okay, he brushed it off, saying he was just tired from work. Still, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind told me that wasn't the whole story. A month later, I got another call. This time it wasn't David. It was someone from the factory where he worked, telling me that my uncle had collapsed on the job and had been taken to the hospital. I dropped everything and flew to Oakland as quickly as I could, hoping it was just a minor issue. But when I arrived, the truth came out. David had cancer, stage 4. He had known for months, maybe longer, but he hadn't told anyone. Not me, not his co-workers, no one. He had been quietly battling the illness while continuing to work at the factory, not wanting to burden anyone with his struggles. A wave of guilt crashed over me. I should have noticed something was wrong. I should have pushed him to tell me what was going on. But David had always been so independent and private that it wasn't surprising he had kept this from me. By the time I reached the hospital, it was too late. David was unconscious, hooked up to machines that were keeping him alive. The doctors told me there wasn't much time left. He had refused treatment for months, choosing to live his life on his own terms rather than let hospitals dictate how much time he had left. After the funeral, I discovered that David had left everything he had to me. It wasn't much, his small apartment, some savings, and a few personal belongings, but it meant the world to me. It wasn't about the money or the possessions. It was the fact that even in his final days, David had thought of me as family. Something my parents never had. For a while, I tried to bury my grief by throwing myself into work, pouring all my energy into Evergreen Capital. But then came the next blow, something I never saw coming. My mother Caroline had always been the strategist in our family. While my father Christopher was a formidable figure in the business world, it was my mother who operated behind the scenes, controlling everything with her cold, calculated demeanor. Even as a child, her icy control unsettled me, and now she had decided to use it against me. Just weeks after David's death, I received a letter from my parents' lawyer. It was a formal notice that they were challenging David's will. They claimed that David had not been of sound mind when he wrote it, and argued that the assets he left to me should legally belong to them. At first, I was in disbelief. My parents had never shown any interest in David or his life, yet now they wanted to take away the only thing he had left me. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. My mother had orchestrated the entire scheme. She convinced my father that David's assets were rightfully theirs and that I didn't deserve anything. She saw this as her opportunity to ruin me. According to one of her friends, she viewed me as a threat, someone who had managed to build a life without her influence, without her approval, and without needing her money. In her warped perspective, I had to be punished for that. The legal battle that followed was nothing short of brutal. My parents had hired the best lawyers their money could buy and weren't afraid to use every manipulative tactic at their disposal. They painted me as an ungrateful son who had abandoned his family and falsely claimed I had coerced David into leaving his estate to me. Of course, it was all lies, but in the world of litigation, truth often takes a backseat to resources and strategy. With Emily and Tom's unwavering support, I fought back. We hired our own legal team, using part of the money we had saved through Evergreen Capital to cover the mounting costs. At this point, it wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about principle. I wasn't going to let my parents strip me of the one thing David had left, the one person who had genuinely cared for me. The fight dragged on for months, with neither side willing to back down. At the same time, my parents began leveraging their connections to sabotage Evergreen Capital. They spread malicious rumors within the financial community, casting doubt on our firm's integrity. Their tactics were underhanded and ruthless, but not surprising. This was exactly the sort of thing my mother excelled at. She wanted to see me fail, to force me to grovel for their help and forgiveness, but I refused to give them that satisfaction. We responded by doubling down on our efforts, working tirelessly to prove ourselves in the market. Our clients remained loyal, trusting us to continue delivering the personalized service we had always promised. Slowly but surely, we began to rebuild the trust of the industry. Then, just as things seemed to be stabilizing, Isabella inserted herself into the chaos. Having grown up as the apple of my parents' eye, Isabella had been shaped into the ideal daughter. Now she became an extension of their animosity toward me. She took to social media, posting thinly veiled accusations of family betrayal and implying I had taken advantage of a sick relative. It was a public relations nightmare. Even though her claims were baseless, they caused real damage to my reputation. I realized I couldn't just fight this battle in court. I had to address it publicly as well. We hired a PR firm to help manage the fallout and share our side of the story. We avoided sinking to their level. We didn't spread lies or publicly attack them. Instead, we focused on ensuring the truth came out. David had left his estate to me because I was the only family member who had ever been there for him. Throughout it all, Emily and Tom were my pillars of strength. Emily, in particular, was my anchor. She never faltered, never doubted that we would emerge stronger. We spent countless late nights in the office, planning our next moves, both legally and in business. It was exhausting on every level, but giving up was never an option. After months of relentless back and forth, we finally had our day in court. My parents' legal team threw everything they had at us, but in the end, the judge ruled in my favor. David's will was upheld, and I was officially recognized as the rightful heir to his estate. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about vindication, proving to my parents that I wasn't the weak, unwanted child they had always believed me to be. But even though I had won, I knew this wasn't the end. My parents wouldn't just fade away. They still had money, power, and influence, and I knew they wouldn't stop trying to tear me down. With the court case behind me and Evergreen Capital stronger than ever, I braced myself for whatever would come next. Winning the court case should have felt like a victory, but instead it felt like a brief pause, a chance to catch my breath before the next storm. There was no true relief. Sure, I had secured David's estate, and my parents had been publicly defeated, but I knew them too well to believe it was over. They wouldn't let this go. For a brief moment, though, I allowed myself to appreciate the success of Evergreen Capital. The firm was thriving. Despite my parents' efforts to tarnish our reputation, we had managed to triple our client base in just 2 years. Our assets under management had grown to nearly $500 million. Tom and I were in discussions about opening a second office in Chicago, while Emily led negotiations with a major European investment fund that could bring in millions more. Things were going well, better than I could have imagined. We were on the verge of breaking into the upper ranks of the financial world. It was ironic, really, that the world I had once despised, the cold, elite circles of wealth, was now the one I was making a place for myself in. But this time, I was not an outsider. I was becoming one of them, though not in the way my parents had ever envisioned. In the midst of this momentum, the next blow hit. It started with a phone call, though not the kind I had anticipated. The SEC had launched an investigation into Evergreen Capital. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. We had been meticulous about compliance, especially after dealing with my parents' sabotage. We ensured every client, account, and transaction adhered to the rules. Tom and I had hired top compliance officers and conducted regular audits to keep everything above board. There was no way we could legitimately be under investigation. But the investigation was real, and it was serious. The Securities and Exchange Commission had received an anonymous tip accusing Evergreen Capital of insider trading. The allegation felt like a punch to the gut. In our industry, even the slightest suspicion of insider trading could destroy a firm. I immediately suspected my parents. It was their style, quiet, underhanded, and using their influence to attack me from the shadows. I wasn't wrong. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the tip had come from someone close to my parents, a lawyer they had worked with for years. They had fabricated evidence, claiming we had acted on insider information from a tech company whose CEO was one of our clients. The entire story was fabricated from beginning to end. But the damage had already been done. The investigation dragged on for months, casting a shadow over everything we had worked so hard to build. Our clients began to lose confidence. Some withdrew their accounts, unwilling to be associated with a firm under scrutiny, while others hesitated to invest new funds, waiting to see how the situation would play out. We were hemorrhaging money, not because of any mistakes on our part, but because my parents had found the one way to hurt me that would cut the deepest. Emily and Tom were incredible throughout this ordeal. Emily, always the optimist, constantly reassured me that the truth would eventually surface and that we would come through this stronger. But it wasn't just the firm's reputation on the line. It was my own. The rumors resurfaced, the same whispers that had followed me for years, that I was the unwanted son, the black sheep of a powerful family, someone destined for failure. My parents' influence ran deep, and their efforts to isolate me were taking effect. Even some of my oldest industry connections began to distance themselves, unwilling to jeopardize their own reputations by staying associated with me. It was this same sense of alienation I had experienced as a child, but this time, it was far worse. I wasn't just losing the respect of a few peers or family members. I was at risk of losing everything I had worked so hard to build. And then, when things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, another blow landed. My father's company, Hastings Financial Group, suddenly announced a significant expansion into the brokerage industry. They planned to launch their own boutique firm to compete directly with Evergreen Capital. It was a perfectly calculated move, designed to take advantage of the SEC investigation hanging over us. My father had seen our vulnerability and decided to capitalize on it. It was a masterstroke. Hastings Financial had the resources, reputation, and connections to overpower us. With the cloud of suspicion still looming, they easily lured away some of our largest clients by positioning themselves as the clean alternative. A firm with impeccable credentials untouched by scandal. Within weeks, they had poached several key clients, offering them better deals and lower fees. I knew this wasn't my father's doing. He had never cared about the brokerage side of finance. This was my mother's work. She had manipulated him into believing this was the best way to destroy me, just as she had orchestrated every attack before. And she was succeeding. At that point, I was ready to fight back with everything I had. We called in our legal team, but going up against Hastings Financial in court was a losing battle. They had deeper pockets, greater influence, and the backing of an established brand. Meanwhile, the SEC investigation loomed over us like a guillotine, ready to drop at any moment. Then, something unexpected happened. In the middle of the chaos, Tom came to me with an idea. Risky, but with the potential to completely change our trajectory. Tom had been quietly networking with a new wave of tech entrepreneurs, many of whom were heavily involved in cryptocurrency. These were individuals who didn't care about old money or the traditional financial system. They were innovators and disruptors, flush with capital and eager to invest. One of these entrepreneurs was Liam Harris, a young billionaire who had made his fortune in the crypto market. Liam was looking for a brokerage firm that could handle the volatile and unpredictable nature of his assets. Evergreen Capital was perfectly positioned to provide the kind of personalized service he needed. Tom's idea was simple: pivot the firm. Instead of trying to compete directly with Hastings Financial and their traditional clients, we would focus on the future: crypto, fintech, and the new generation of investors who didn't adhere to the old rules. It was a bold move, no doubt. The cryptocurrency market was highly unpredictable, and most established firms avoided it due to regulatory uncertainties. But we were running out of options. If we stayed on our current path, Hastings Financial would crush us, and the SEC investigation would finish whatever remained. Emily was hesitant at first. She was always the cautious one, focused on stability and long-term growth. But even she recognized that we needed to take a leap of faith. If we didn't, we were finished. So we took the risk. We rebranded Evergreen Capital as a forward-thinking, tech-savvy firm specializing in high-growth, high-risk assets. We leaned into the chaos of the crypto market, tailoring our services to tech entrepreneurs, startup founders, and venture capitalists willing to embrace risk. It was a gamble, but it paid off. Within months, we secured several high-profile clients, including Liam Harris. His wealth alone was enough to keep the firm afloat. The pivot succeeded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not only did we survive the assault from Hastings Financial, but we began to thrive in our new niche. The SEC eventually cleared us of all charges, finding no evidence of insider trading. As we had suspected, the entire investigation had been a setup. By then, however, we had already moved on, establishing ourselves as a leader in the new financial frontier. Hastings Financial couldn't gain any traction in the crypto world. They were too entrenched in their traditional ways, too focused on legacy markets, and unable to keep up with the rapid innovation we had embraced. My parents were furious. They had thrown everything at me: legal battles, public smears, corporate sabotage, but I had found a way to outmaneuver them. Not only had I survived, but I had succeeded. They had underestimated me, as they always had, and now they were left to watch as Evergreen Capital grew stronger than ever. But this victory wasn't just about the business. It was about proving to myself that I didn't need them, that I had never needed them. Everything I had accomplished, I had built on my own. No amount of money, influence, or power could take that away from me. For the first time, I felt truly free. Free from the shadow of my parents, free from the constraints of the world I had grown up in, and free to forge my own path. The battle wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new competitors, and new obstacles to overcome. But now I knew, without a doubt, that I was ready to face whatever came next.